And welcome. We are going to take a look at the characteristics of living things in some detail. In the lesson, you would have already looked at what science is and why this is important to know in the study of biology, which is the study of living things. So let's take a look at these characteristics. Of course, we are familiar with the acronym GRIMNER. So we're going to go through these main characteristics using this acronym to be able to identify whether something is alive or not. The first one is G, growth. And in the first image here, we see a picture of a plant. We have a small plant. So let me just get the pointer here. Right? We have a small plant, a baby plant, or we could call it a baby plant. And over time, we see it going from this small version of itself to a larger and a larger version. But notice it's not just getting larger, or in the case of this plant, taller. It's also getting broader. The stem is getting broader. It's getting wooden. You now have a wooden thick stem. And you also notice that it goes from 3 leaves to 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves, and then more leaves. Of course, not just more leaves, they have more branches, etc. So it's more than just growing in size. It's also increased in complexity. All right. So we can see here that growth is more than just increase in size, but also increase in mass, increase in complexity, etc. And here we have an example where we have a nice little animation showing us the division of cells over time. And for unicellular organisms, of course, these are organisms that are made up of just one cell. So for unicellular organisms, growth for them is really, you can't really use the same approach because it's only so big a unicellular organism can get. It's only so big one cell can get. So in the case of unicellular organisms, we talk about the cell division. When they multiply in number, that is defined as growth for these kinds of organisms that are made up of one cell. So let's see how can we describe growth in a sentence, right? We can describe it as an increase in mass and or size. And of course, as we just saw, it's not just mass and size, also complexity, maturation. And that is why many times when you find scientists talking about growth, it's not just growth, but growth and development, right? So, but to keep it really simple, we we refer to growth as an increase in mass and or size, as we just saw in these two examples. So let's move on. We have here respiration. Respiration that's the second letter, R, in GRIMNER. And we see here this flowchart. And this flowchart essentially represents a series of chemical reactions. So, for example, glycolysis, that is a chemical reaction. We have here in a rectangle pyruvate, which is a major reactant. That's a chemical that's involved in these chemical reactions, right? We have further chemical reactions. So everything in the oval is a chemical reaction. We have fermentation, we have oxidative decarboxylation, Krebs cycle, and so on. So respiration is not breathing, which is what a lot of us would have mixed up in our lives. We tend to think, okay, when you're respiring, I'm breathing. No, actually, respiration is a series of chemical reactions, or what we call a chemical process that is going on in your cells. So in all of your cells, this is happening. All right. And you notice that this guy, ATP, is partly a very important reactant, and it's a very important substrate, sorry, a very important product of respiration, right? This ATP is what is used to transfer energy throughout the body. And we also have another example here, which we are seeing, we are looking at a very important experiment that also led scientists to delve deeper into respiration in the very early days of science and the very early days of biological investigations. And we see here that the yeast, it's a yeast solution, and we see over time, it's a time lapse where you have a buildup of gas in this area. And we wouldn't see it in this picture, but this tube is essentially sealed at the top, right? So that means this gas that is pushing the yeast out this way is coming from the yeast itself. And this is one of those phenomena that led scientists say, okay, something is going on here. Let's delve deeper into it. And one of the things they discovered is the chemical process of respiration, which produces a gas. And those of us that are familiar, we would know that gas is carbon dioxide, right? So let's take a look at how would we describe this in words? We say that respiration is the release of energy from food in a form that the body can use, right? So let's just go back to the previous. When we talk about food, so we're looking at this glucose, yeah, right? Glucose would be coming from the food that we eat, juice that we drink, some bread, etc. Same thing, this yeast solution has sugar in it, which could be sucrose, which can be then broken down into glucose. So therefore, the sucrose or the glucose is being broken down to produce energy, and one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide for a particular type of respiration. So that's why we can then say that respiration is the release of energy from food in a form that the body can use. That would be the ATP, right? And this occurs via a series, as we saw it, a series of chemical reactions. Right, so that's respiration. Let's move on to the next letter, which is I, which is irritability. Right, now irritability, as we can see here, we have a nice little deer who is a deer, yes. And the deer is at the watering hole, drinking some water. And then this crocodile comes out of nowhere. Now, what we are paying attention to is the main thing we're paying attention to is to the deer. We're realizing that this deer has just experienced a rapid change in its external environment. A crocodile showed up and tried to eat it, and it responded to that crocodile coming out of the water to eat it by jumping away. All right, so that is basically what irritability is. It's a response to a change in your environment. And it doesn't have to just be a change in your external environment, it can also be a change in your internal environment. But we can delve into that later on. So let's see what we can talk, how can we describe it in a nice little sentence. You can say that irritability is the ability to react to changes outside the body as well as internal changes. When we look into homeostasis and all the ways in which your body maintains balance in your body, that also is an aspect of responding to internal changes in your body. So let's take a look at the next letter, movement, M. And we see here, we see almost, it's almost like a beautiful, king of carnival or queen of carnival costume. But actually, this is a time lapse of cacti, a cactus, the flowers of a cactus over time, right? So over time, the flowers of the cactus is, basically blooming, right? Now, if I were to sit and look at this cactus at any point of the day, I would not be seeing this kind of movement. This is a time lapse, which means that it's been recorded over several hours and then sped up. So in normal time, regular time, we might look at a plant and be like, oh, the plant isn't really doing anything, it's not moving. But if we do it over time, we can see that, yeah, plants do show movement. And this is one of the more exciting, glamorous examples. But for plants, um, growth is a form of movement because, as you can see, the flowers are, yes, they're blooming, but for example, you would have plants that grow towards the sun or grow towards a source of light. That is a form of movement as well, because if you do a time lapse of a plant, say over several days, and you moved it, you can actually see it growing towards wherever the light source is. Let's say you move a plant to the window, you would see that the plant would shift its position in space so that it is now it's facing whatever light source in order to get as much light as possible. So that's the general um, example of growth for all plants. But of course, we have these types of movement, which in plant time is rapid, where you have blooming of flowers, which is usually managed by um, different processes, including osmosis and release of water and all of that, right? So that's plant movement. The other one we are more familiar with when we think about movement is this kind of movement where we are moving from one point to the other. And if you notice in this, you would see that the person is moving from one point in position in space to another position in space and back. Now, this is a very specific type of movement. This is called locomotion. So changing my position in space or changing my, how am I oriented in space? For example, the cactus flowers, their orientation in space, that is movement, but there's also a very specific type of movement, which is movement from one position in space to another position in space, and that is called locomotion. But all of that falls under the umbrella of movement. And we have here movement, the ability to change one's position and or location in space in a nice little sentence. So let's take a look at the next letter, N, nutrition. So we have here on the left, we have some breadfruit, some nice food. The thing one next to it is jackfruit. You all can correct me, right? We have in the little corner some lemons, some limes, sorry, right? And these are the basically food. We take that, we cook it, make some oil down, and we eat it. So that's a specific type of nutrition where we are accessing nutrients from an external source. And then on the other side here, we have leaves, which are organs of photosynthesis for plants. And that represents another type of nutrition where plants take light from the sun, take light energy and use it to produce food, to manufacture their own food. Hence the term photosynthesis, right? So you have two different types of nutrition. You access nutrients from outside of you, and in another one, you manufacture the nutrients that you need. And in a sentence, we would say that nutrition is the ability to obtain or manufacture food, right, which is the source of energy and materials needed to build and maintain the body. So as we can see, obtain or manufacture food. And here we also have a definition for food, source of, right, energy and materials. So let's move on to E. So we have here a nice little familiar organ on the left side here. We have here our kidneys, right? And our kidneys are what you would call an excretory organ. It is very important to the process of actively taking metabolic waste. So metabolic waste would be byproducts of the all the different chemical processes going on in the body, the byproducts that are not useful or actually dangerous to the body. The kidneys are one of those organs that actively removes those waste products from the body. And on the right hand side here, we have these nice, beautiful leaves, right? Different colors. And this is another approach, another strategy for excretion, where these same metabolic byproducts are instead deposited into some part of the plant body that will be shed in a short space of time. So anytime you okay, there are leaves that are going to be shed soon, all the various metabolic waste products are deposited into those leaves, and those leaves fall away from the tree. That also applies to the bark of a tree. Various metabolic waste products are shunted over to the bark, and of course, over time, the bark goes out of the tree and is shed from the tree. So, in a sentence, we would say that excretion is the removal of these waste products from the body, right? Um, Removal of metabolic, I would insist as well, metabolic waste products from the body. And of course, I say here these are waste products of chemical reactions in the body. And we have here reproduction, the last R. And we have here reproduction. Of course, we have a young lady that is pregnant. She's in a state of pregnancy, probably second trimester, right? And of course, we also have for unicellular organisms cell division. And this shows you that in either case, whether you're a unicellular organism or a multicellular organism, for you reproduction is basically making more versions of yourself. You're making new individuals of the same species. And for unicellular organism, that is basically just dividing into two and then four and then 16. And for humans and other animals and other plants, etc., it's an actual process that you go through in order to produce a new individual, one or more new individuals of the same species. And there we go. Reproduction, the production of new individuals that are similar to yourself, right? It wouldn't be exactly the same in most cases, except for unicellular organisms, but they would be similar. And of course, there are others. As we kept talking about unicellular, multicellular, there's the cell theory, the fact that every living organism is made up of one or more cells. And we touched on homeostasis, which is the ability to maintain internal environmental conditions. And of course, this would also fall under the umbrella of irritability because it is one of the ways in which your body responds, right, to internal changes in your environment, changes in your internal environment. And that's it for your various characteristics of life. Okay, so time to move on to the next stage of your lesson.